67 tons. That's not the load, that's the machine itself. 67 tons of iron, boilerplate, gears, shafts, pistons, and bad ideas bolted together and sent crawling into terrain where railroads had no business existing. Not across prairies, not along river valleys, but straight up mountainsides, through mud that could swallow a man, over track laid yesterday and already trying to return to the earth. And somehow it worked. Not smoothly, not safely, not reliably, but it worked often enough that entire forests disappeared behind it. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Every railroad engineer of the era knew it. Conventional locomotives needed gentle grades, solid ballast, wide curves, carefully surveyed alignments. They were precision machines that demanded order. Logging railroads were the opposite of order. They were temporary scars carved into wilderness by men racing against time, weather, and bankruptcy. Rails spiked into ties laid directly on dirt. Bridges built from green timber. Curves so tight you could touch both sides of the train at once. Grades that would make a civil engineer laugh out loud and walk away. And yet into this chaos, they sent a machine that weighed more than a house and expected it to haul entire forests behind it. This is the story of the Iron Beast train that should not have worked, and the men who climbed into its cab knowing that physics was not on their side. The year is somewhere between 1905 and 1920, depending on which railroad you're standing on. The place is the American frontier's last raw edge. The Cascades, the Coast Range, the Sierras, the deep timber country where roads didn't exist and rivers ran the wrong way. Lumber is money, and money is wading uphill. The only question is how to get it down alive. Horses can't do it anymore. The loads are too heavy, the distances too far, the slopes too steep. Oxen break legs, teams die in the mud. Cable systems help, but they're slow and limited. What the timber companies want is speed. They want volume. They want to strip a mountainside bare before winter hits or the mill runs dry. So they build railroads. Not permanent ones. These aren't meant to last 50 years. They're meant to last 5, maybe 10, just long enough to suck the forest dry and vanish. The rails are light. The ties are rough cut. The ballast is whatever rock and dirt the crew can scrape together. Some sections don't even bother with ballast at all, ties laid straight on soil, hoping friction and habit will keep them in place. Then comes the problem: what pulls the train? A normal locomotive won't survive this. Its drive wheels slip. Its rigid frame binds on curves. Its weight concentrates on too few axles, crushing the track beneath it. Run it hard enough and it derails. Run it light enough and it stalls. Either way, it fails. So someone, usually a logger, not an engineer, decides to ignore every rule and try something else. Instead of speed, they choose torque. Instead of elegance, they choose brute force. Instead of pretending the track is perfect, they build a locomotive that expects it to be terrible. The result is a 67-ton geared locomotive, a machine that looks wrong the moment you see it. The boiler sits high and awkward. The wheels are smaller than you'd expect. Exposed shafts run along the sides like bones. Gears mesh where rods should be. Nothing about it suggests grace or velocity. It looks like a factory that learned how to move. This engine doesn't sprint, it crawls. 5 miles an hour on a good day, 2 on a bad one. But what it lacks in speed, it makes up for in something far more important. It will pull when nothing else can. Inside the boiler, water is being turned into controlled violence. Coal and wood feed a fire that never truly sleeps. Steam builds pressure, 180, sometimes 200 pounds per square inch, contained by riveted steel that creaks and pops as it heats. That pressure drives pistons, not directly connected to the wheels but to a central crankshaft. From there, power is transferred through gears, down line shafts, and into every axle. Every wheel is driven, every axle fights. Instead of slipping uselessly, the wheels turn together, biting into the rail with steady, grinding determination. Where a conventional locomotive would spin itself into exhaustion, this thing just leans harder. That's the theory anyway. In practice, nothing about this is gentle. The engineer sits high in the cab, exposed to wind, smoke, and the constant vibration of machinery that was never meant to be comfortable. There's no insulation, no suspension worth mentioning. Every gear change shudders through the frame. Every rail joint punches up through the seat. You don't ride this locomotive so much as endure it. Your hands stay on the throttle and the brake. Your eyes never leave the track, because the track is lying to you. A curve that looks fine from a distance tightens suddenly. A section that held yesterday has slumped overnight. A trestle built from fresh-cut timber groans under the weight of iron it was never designed to carry. You don't trust anything. Not the rails, not the bridge, not even the engine itself. Behind you, the train stretches out like a steel spine. Flat cars stacked with logs, some longer than the locomotive itself, chained down and creaking with every movement. Each car weighs tens of tons. Multiply that by 10, 15, 20 cars, and suddenly gravity becomes the enemy. Going uphill, gravity is the wall you have to climb. Going downhill, it's a predator at your back. The climb is where the iron beast earns its reputation. The grade steepens, 5%, 6, 7, numbers that would make a standard railroad shut down operations entirely. You open the throttle. Steam roars through pipes. The exhaust sharpens into a barking rhythm as pistons hammer back and forth. The gears howl, a sound like metal screaming at metal, amplified by the surrounding forest. The locomotive slows, but it doesn't stop. Trees slide past the cab window at walking speed. You can hear individual logs shifting behind you. You can feel the strain through the floorboards. This is not smooth power. This is force applied one brutal increment at a time. Every tooth on every gear is carrying load. If one fails, it won't fail quietly. And sometimes it doesn't. A broken gear tooth doesn't just stop the train. It sends shock through the drivetrain. Shafts twist. Bearings seize. Steam pressure spikes as the load suddenly changes. The engineer has seconds to react, to shut down before the machine tears itself apart. Too slow, and the locomotive becomes its own wrecking ball. But most days it holds. The beast climbs. At the top of the grade, there's no triumph, no celebration. You don't shut down and admire the view. You immediately start worrying about the descent. Because gravity doesn't care how strong your engine is. Downhill, the locomotive is no longer the thing pulling the train. It's the thing trying to hold it back. The logs want to run. The cars want to push. The rails, lightly laid and imperfect, are now under compressive forces they were never designed for. Braking is primitive. Wooden brake shoes press against steel wheels. They smoke. They heat. They wear down fast. Too much braking and they catch fire. Too little and the train accelerates beyond control. There is no margin for error, only a narrow band between disaster and survival. The engineer listens more than he looks. He listens to the pitch of the exhaust, the grind of the gears, the scream of the brakes. He smells hot metal before he sees smoke. He feels vibration change through the seat when something starts to go wrong. If a car derails behind you, you might not know immediately. The first sign is often a sudden change in resistance, a lurch that travels forward through the couplings. If you don't react fast enough, the derailed car pulls the next one off the rails, and then the next. A chain reaction of destruction, logs spilling, rails twisting, cars folding like paper. Wrecks happen often. When they do, the response is not shock, it's procedure. You shut down, you check for dead men, you check for steam leaks, you assess what can be salvaged. The crew grabs jacks, chains, blocks, they derail what they can. What they can't, they cut loose and leave. The forest will reclaim it eventually. This is not a railroad built for permanence. It's built for extraction. And that's why the 67-ton Iron Beast train exists at all, because it doesn't need perfection. It doesn't demand comfort. It doesn't pretend the world is orderly. It accepts chaos and pushes through it with gears and steam and stubbornness. But acceptance doesn't mean safety. Every trip is a negotiation with physics. Every mile is a gamble. The men who run these machines know that if something goes wrong in the wrong place, a bridge, a curve, a grade, there may be no fixing it. There may only be wreckage and silence and the long walk back to camp to tell someone's bunkmate he won't be needing his boots anymore. By the time the train reaches the landing or the mill, no one is celebrating. They're just relieved. Relieved that the boiler held. Relieved that the track didn't give way. Relieved that the iron beast did what it was never supposed to do one more time. And tomorrow they'll fire it up again. Because the forest is still standing uphill, and iron doesn't get to rest. By morning, the rails had already shifted. No one was surprised by that. They never were. Track on a logging railroad was a temporary agreement with the ground, not a permanent solution. You laid it down, you hoped it held, and you accepted that overnight rain, frost, or gravity itself might renegotiate the deal while you slept. The crew knew before the locomotive even came into view. The rails told them. A tie pushed up where it shouldn't be. A joint pulled apart just enough to catch the flange of a wheel. Mud bleeding through ballast that was never more than dirt and broken stone to begin with. This wasn't neglect. This was the reality of building a railroad as fast as the forest could be cut. And today, the iron beast was coming through again. The track gang worked ahead of the train, spike mauls swinging in rhythm, driving iron into green wood ties that still smelled like sap. Boom, boom, boom. The sound echoed through the trees, warning everything alive to get out of the way. These men weren't finesse workers. They were muscle and timing. A four-man crew could drive spikes faster than a machine if the men were good and the weather didn't freeze their hands numb. They knew the locomotive's weight. 67 tons before you even added fuel and water. They also knew what happened when the track wasn't ready. They'd seen rails fold. They'd seen ties snap. They'd seen engines tip just enough to spill steam and panic into the cab. So they worked fast, because fast was the only option. The iron beast announced itself long before it arrived. First came the sound. A low mechanical roar filtered through exhaust bark and gear howl. Then the vibration, felt through the ground before it was heard in the air. The forest seemed to tense as the locomotive rounded the curve, smoke hanging low in the trees, steam drifting from valves and joints like breath in cold air. Up close, it was worse than it looked from a distance. Oil streaked down the side frames, catching dust and grit. The exposed gears glistened with grease, teeth flashing as they meshed under load. The boiler popped and ticked as pressure fluctuated. Nothing about the machine was quiet and nothing about it was subtle. It was a moving argument against nature, conducted entirely in steel. The engineer leaned forward in the cab, eyes locked on the rail ahead. He didn't trust yesterday's repairs. He didn't trust last night's weather. He trusted only what he could see right now, and even that was suspect. The throttle came back slightly. Speed dropped to a crawl. This wasn't caution. This was survival. As the locomotive eased onto the suspect section, the rails flexed. You could see it happen. Steel bending downward under weight, ties pressing into soft ground, ballast shifting with a wet, grinding sound. The flanges rode dangerously close to the edge of the railhead. No one breathed. Then the engine rolled through, slowly, reluctantly, but upright. The crew exhaled and went back to work, because there would be another bad section a quarter-mile ahead and another after that. This was not a railroad you finished building. This was a railroad you chased, constantly trying to stay one step ahead of destruction. The problem wasn't just weight, it was force. A geared locomotive doesn't deliver power smoothly the way a fast passenger engine does. It delivers it in pulses. Every piston stroke transmits torque through gears, through shafts, into axles that grip the rail and twist. That twisting force tries to spread the rails apart, On weak track, it succeeds. That's why derailments weren't rare events. They were expected events. When the iron beast left the rails, it didn't do so gently. One wheel climbing over the rail was enough. The rest followed. The locomotive lurched, metal screaming against metal, and then gravity took over. 67 tons does not stop when it wants to go somewhere else. Sometimes the engine tipped just enough to bury itself in dirt and mud, still upright but hopelessly off alignment. Other times it rolled. Boilers crushed cabs. Cabs crushed men. Steam scalded anything nearby. A derailment could kill without warning, turning a routine run into a recovery operation in seconds. When it happened, the response was immediate and brutal. Steam shut off. Fire damped. Men scattered to safe distance in case the boiler decided to fail under stress. Then the long work began. Rerailing a locomotive that heavy wasn't elegant. It was leverage and desperation. Jacks creaked under load. Chains groaned. Timber cribbing stacked and restacked as the crew inched the engine back toward the rails. Every movement was deliberate because a slipped jack could crush a leg, a foot, a skull. Sometimes it took hours, sometimes days. And sometimes they didn't bother. If the locomotive was damaged beyond quick repair, or if the line was already nearing abandonment, they salvaged what they could and left the rest. There are places in the mountains where you can still find the bones of these machines, half-buried, gears rusted solid, boilers collapsed inward like empty shells. The forest doesn't forget. It just waits. But when the iron beast stayed on the rails, when the track held and the gears kept turning, something extraordinary happened. The impossible became routine. Trains climbed grades that had no right to exist. They crept across trestles built from trees cut weeks earlier. They curved around mountainsides where a misjudgment of inches meant a drop of hundreds of feet. They hauled timber in volumes that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The mills noticed. Production increased. Schedules tightened. More track was laid. The railroad pushed farther into the forest, chasing stands of timber that had once been considered unreachable, and every mile of new rail meant another mile of risk. The crews changed too. New men arrived, drawn by pay that reflected danger. Old men left deaf, scarred, missing fingers or worse. The engineer's seat was rarely empty, but the faces behind the throttle changed with unsettling frequency. Some quit. Some were carried out. Some simply didn't show up one morning, their names quietly removed from the bunkhouse roster. The fireman had it worst. He stood on the deck, feeding the boiler constantly, eyes flicking between the firebox, the water glass, and the pressure gauge. Too much fire and pressure spiked. Too little and the engine lost power at the worst possible moment. He shoveled fuel until his shoulders burned and his lungs filled with smoke. In winter, sweat froze in his clothes. In summer, the heat was relentless. If the boiler ran dry, everything ended. The crown sheet would overheat. The metal would weaken, and then the boiler would let go. It didn't snap. It rolled. The outside rail, already weakened by soft ground, twisted outward under load. The flange lost its guide. The wheel followed gravity instead of steel. The locomotive lurched. 67 tons shifted sideways in an instant. Tools flew. The fireman slammed into the boiler casing. The engineer fought the controls as the cab tilted. The world outside suddenly angled wrong. Metal screamed. The lead truck jumped the rail completely. The rest of the locomotive tried to follow. The gears continued turning, driving wheels that were no longer aligned, tearing at ties and dirt. The engine didn't derail so much as plow. The engineer killed the throttle and dumped steam, a white cloud erupting around the cab. The firemen scrambled for the dampers, choking the fire before it could spike pressure in a moment when the boiler was under stress it had never known. Behind them, the first car derailed. Then the second. The third followed, pulled off by the momentum of the load. Logs broke free, rolling, bouncing, smashing into trees with enough force to splinter trunks. Chains snapped like thread. Iron fittings tore loose, spinning through the air. The train jackknifed. When it finally stopped, the forest was silent except for the hiss of steam and the ticking of cooling metal. Rain fell harder now, drumming on boiler plate and broken timber alike. No one moved for several seconds. That pause mattered. Men had learned not to rush wrecks. Steam burns didn't announce themselves politely. Boilers sometimes failed after derailments, not during them, as stresses redistributed and weakened seams finally gave up. The engineer climbed down first, boots slipping in mud and oil. He checked the boiler instinctively, hand hovering near the metal without touching. Still intact. No visible leaks. The fireman followed, coughing, eyes wide, face streaked with soot. "Everyone alive?" the engineer called. Answers came back slowly. Shaken, bruised, one man with a cut on his head, another with a twisted ankle, no one crushed, no one pinned. This time the railroad had spared them. That wouldn't always be the case. Cleanup began immediately because it always did. You didn't leave a wreck to think about what it meant. You dealt with it. Men grabbed jacks, chains, axes. Logs that could be salvaged were moved. Cars that could be re-rolled were re-rolled. The locomotive sat at an angle, half on, half off the track, like a wounded animal refusing to lie down. Re-railing it would take the rest of the day, maybe longer. While they worked, the forest watched. Broken trees leaned at odd angles. Fresh scars bled sap. The ground was churned into mud and splinters. This was the cost of speed, written directly onto the land. The engineer stood aside for a moment, catching his breath. He looked back up the grade they'd descended, the curve that had betrayed them. Tomorrow the track gang would fix it. They'd tamp dirt. They'd add cribbing. They'd de-spike it tighter, and it would hold for a while. That was the rhythm: build, break, repair, repeat. This derailment wasn't exceptional. It wasn't even unusual. Logging railroads expected a certain number of wrecks per season. They budgeted for them. Equipment was insured. Men were replaceable, though no one said that out loud. What mattered was that the iron beast could be put back on the rails. Because once it was, it would go right back to work. There was no inquiry, no investigation, no report filed with a safety board. The lesson would be passed verbally, if at all. Watch that curve. Ease the brake earlier. She likes to pull right when she's heavy. Knowledge survived only if the men who carried it did. By nightfall, the locomotive was upright again, steam pressure slowly rebuilding as the firemen coaxed the boiler back to life. The gears turned tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The beast had been hurt, but not killed. They'd leave the derailed cars behind for now, chained to trees so they wouldn't slide farther downhill. Salvage would come later. The priority was getting the engine back to camp before dark. As the iron beast limped forward, moving under its own power once more, no one cheered. They were too tired, too aware of how close they'd come. The forest closed in behind them, rain washing away tracks, steam drifting into the canopy. By morning, it would be hard to tell exactly where the wreck had happened. Except for the men who'd been there. They would remember the sound of metal giving way, the way the cab tilted, the moment when gravity almost won. Those memories would ride with them on every downhill run from then on. And tomorrow, or the next day, or the next curve after that, gravity would try again. By the time the locomotive limped back into camp, night had already settled into the timber. Lanterns glowed weakly against the dark, hanging from nails driven into posts, swinging slightly in the cold air. Steam drifted low along the ground, lit orange by firelight, making the iron beast look half submerged, like something crawling out of a swamp instead of returning from the line. No one gathered to admire it. There was no pride in survival here. Survival was the baseline. The firemen killed the draft and sealed the firebox for the night. The boiler ticked and sighed as it cooled, metal contracting in small, sharp noises that echoed across the landing. Men leaned on tools, shoulders slumped, hands shaking from fatigue and adrenaline. Someone passed around a tin cup of coffee that tasted like burnt water and desperation. Tomorrow, they'd be back on the wreck. Tonight, they took inventory. 2 cars destroyed beyond quick repair, 3 more damaged but salvageable, a dozen logs split or crushed, useless for milling, 1 injured brakeman who'd be out for weeks if he came back at all. No dead men. That mattered more than the rest combined. The superintendent made a note in his ledger. Losses tallied in numbers, not names. Downtime estimated. Replacement equipment requested by telegraph. The railroad absorbed the damage like it always did, quietly, efficiently, without reflection. The men, on the other hand, carried it with them. Logging railroads created a specific kind of worker, not reckless, not fearless, but resigned. These were men who understood that machines failed, track failed, and sometimes people failed with them. You didn't curse bad luck. You didn't ask why. You learned the patterns and hoped you de-recognized the next one in time. The engineer lay awake that night, boots still on, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling of the bunkhouse. He replayed the descent in his head, the throttle position, the brake pressure. The moment the wheel climbed, he'd made the best decision he could with the information he had. He knew that. And still, doubt crept in. On logging railroads, doubt was dangerous. It slowed you down. It made you hesitate when hesitation could kill. The trick was to remember the lesson without letting it hollow you out. At first light, the camp came alive again. The track gang headed out ahead of the locomotive, carrying jacks, shovels, spike mauls, and bundles of ties cut fresh the night before. They'd rebuild the curve properly this time, or as properly as you could rebuild anything meant to carry 67 tons across wet earth. They dug deeper. They cribbed with logs. They widened the gauge slightly to account for flex under load. None of it came from textbooks. It came from experience, passed down from men who'd seen engines roll and lived long enough to learn why. The locomotive followed slowly, boiler hot, but pressure kept deliberately low. No one trusted yesterday's metal until it proved itself again. The iron beast seemed subdued, its exhaust quieter, its pace almost cautious, though everyone knew that was projection. Machines didn't learn. Men did. As the train crept past the rebuilt curve, every eye watched the rails. The ties held. The steel flexed and settled but didn't give. Someone spat into the dirt, a small ritual acknowledgement that the forest had allowed them another passage. Beyond the curve the grade eased, then climbed again toward fresh stands of timber. Logging didn't pause for wrecks. Trees were already felled uphill, waiting. Chokers had been set. Cars stood empty and ready. The iron beast took a breath and went back to work. This was the paradox of the geared logging locomotive. It was a solution built on constant failure. It worked not because it was perfect, but because it could be repaired quickly enough to keep moving. Broken gears could be swapped. Bent rods straightened. Boilers patched. Track rebuilt overnight. Entire operations balanced on the idea that damage was inevitable and acceptable. That mindset bled into the men. They learned to fix rather than prevent, to react rather than plan too far ahead. A landslide took out a trestle. Build a temporary one by morning. A derailment blocked the line. Rerail or reroute. A locomotive tipped but didn't kill anyone. Get it upright and moving again before the mill noticed the delay. And the mill always noticed. Downstream, far from the mud and the wrecks, sawmills ran on schedules and contracts. Logs arrived or they didn't. If they didn't, the mill went idle. Idle mills cost money. Idle mills closed. And closed mills ended careers, not just jobs. That pressure flowed uphill, through managers, foremen, engineers, and finally into the cab of the iron beast itself. Speed mattered. Output mattered. Safety mattered only insofar as it preserved speed and output. It wasn't cruelty, it was economics. The locomotive was pushed hard because it had to be. Every extra car added to the train was a risk. Every run in bad weather was a gamble. But leaving timber standing was worse. Standing timber didn't pay wages. As the days passed, the wreck faded into routine memory. Another story added to a growing collection of near misses and hard lessons. New men heard it told secondhand around campfires. The details shifted. The curve got steeper. The speed got faster. That's how logging stories worked. Exaggeration wasn't lying. It was emphasis. What didn't change was the outcome. The iron beast survived. The line stayed open. The forest thinned. Month by month, the railroad pushed farther. Switchbacks multiplied. Grades steepened. The locomotive hauled longer trains over worse track than it ever had before. Its reputation grew. So did its scars. Plates were patched. Rivets replaced. Gears showed wear patterns that told stories of loads barely controlled. By the end of the season, the iron beast barely resembled the machine that had arrived new from the factory. It was heavier with repairs, looser in some joints, stiffer in others. It had become a custom machine shaped by a specific place and a specific kind of abuse. Men trusted it because they understood it. They knew its moods. They knew when it would pull and when it would protest. They listened for changes in exhaust rhythm, felt for subtle vibrations through the floor. They treated it less like equipment and more like a dangerous animal that could be handled if respected. But respect only went so far. Winter came early that year. Snow fell on unfinished track, ice-coated rails and trestles. Braking distances stretched even further. The iron beast faced its most dangerous season, when downhill runs became slides and every curve threatened betrayal. Still it ran. Logs moved, mills stayed fed, the railroad earned its keep. And every night, as the boiler cooled and the camp settled into uneasy sleep, the iron beast sat quietly in the dark, steam drifting from seams, metal contracting, waiting for morning. It had been built to do something it shouldn't have been able to do, and against all reason, it kept doing it. Not forever. Nothing like this ever lasted forever. But long enough.